You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. When people hear the term out-of-control sexual behavior, they tend to associate it primarily with men. Historically, most of the research, clinical models, and public conversations around problematic sexual behavior have focused almost exclusively on male experiences. But women can struggle with out-of-control sexual behavior too, and their experiences have often been misunderstood, overlooked, or filtered through frameworks that weren't designed with women in mind. At the same time, women's sexuality has long been judged more harshly than men's, which raises important questions about where we draw the line between genuinely problematic behavior and normal sexual variation. When does high sexual desire actually become a problem? How do shame, trauma, attachment, and cultural double standards shape the way that women experience distress around their sexuality? And are we sometimes pathologizing women simply for violating expectations around what female sexuality is supposed to look like? Today, we're exploring the psychology of out-of-control sexual behavior in women, including why this topic has been so understudied and what more compassionate, sex-positive treatment approaches can offer. I am joined once again by Jess Levith, a licensed marriage and family therapist and certified sex therapist. She's fully trained in both attachment-focused EMDR therapy and trauma-focused acceptance and commitment therapy. She works with LGBTQIA and kinky folks, consensual non-monogamy, women's sexual health, and out-of-control sexual behavior. Okay, Jess. So one of the things that you argue in your work is that women's sexuality has historically been understudied and misunderstood, especially when it comes to things like problematic sexual behavior. I think a lot of people assume that that is mostly a male phenomenon, in part because almost all of the research and many of the treatment models for that were built around men. So how has that shaped the way that we think about problematic sexual behavior in women? And why is it important to study and better understand women's experiences with this specifically?
I was in 12-step for sex and love addiction for almost a decade. And I went in when I was 25. I was by far the youngest and one of the few women. And it was really hurtful that all of the materials being provided to me as a woman were about love addiction, when I was also struggling sexually. I was always very curious about this. And so I, did some digging. And as you say, most of the research is done on men. Mm-hmm. And even the amazing OCSB model that I now work with was created by men for cis gay men. Mm-hmm. So I started taking Michael and Doug's work and started going through the book and saying, what would this look like for a woman? I just translated everything. And what I realized is that one of the reasons I love the OCSB model is because it's so flexible and it's so based on being a human instead of having this sexual pathology. And so a lot of it translated very easily to working with women. But what I kept coming up against was this social imprinting that women have had to take on in various realms around birth control and being labeled, an nymphomaniac, if we happen to have a high sexual drive, right? And the dysregulation being about dysregulation. And that's more of an attachment thing. It's not a love addiction. Mm-hmm. I don't want to pathologize connection with other human beings.
And when you say OCSB, that stands for?
Out of control sexual behavior.
And so how is out of control sexual behavior, how is viewing this through that lens different from the sort of traditional sex addiction lens that many people are proponents of? And, as I've talked about many times before on the show, a lot of people not really big fans of the whole sex addiction model generally. So how is the out of control sexual behavior model different than that?
I think at least it was something for some people to hold on to. Some kind of frame to normalize what was happening. But I think it has been incredibly hurtful to a lot of people. It sees this issue of out of control sexual behavior or dysregulation as a pathological disease. And it has been attempted a few times to get into the DSM or the diagnostic manual for disorders, and it's been rejected because there isn't evidence that shows it has the same mechanisms as an addiction, as a food addiction. It's not the same. But what happens is you have someone come into my office that's already labeled themselves as a sex addict. So on top of everything they're struggling with, now they've also got this label, you know? And so OCSB is saying, this is a regulatory issue. We regulate ourselves as human beings with other human beings for all of our emotions and feelings. We all play off of each other. And this is one of those ways. So in this particular scenario, your attachment and your sexuality have kind of become fused, and someone else's moving towards you or away from you is impacting arousal. It's seen as a few different things. It's seen sometimes as erotic conflict, which is when we have an eroticism that is in conflict with something internal within us or something external within our community. It's seen as an attachment regulation, and it's seen as self-regulation issue. That's how we frame it. We don't say you are an addict and there's nothing you can do about it. That takes away the responsibility of the person.
Yeah. And, I think a lot of the struggle around getting something like out of control sexual behavior listed as a disorder in the DSM is that it's hard to define what out of control actually means, right? And this is something we'll get into more a little bit later is the behavior actually out of control, or does the person have that internal conflict that is maybe they're engaging this behavior at a very low level, but the fact that they're doing it at all is creating an internal conflict for them. And so it's not really out of control in the sense that they're doing it like excessively. It's out of control in the sense that it's a desire or urge or behavior that they don't want to have or don't want to do. And so that's one level to it. And then there's also this question of, well, how much is too much when it comes to things like sex and masturbation and porn use? And there's some inherent subjectivity in that, and I've seen all kinds of like wacky attempts over the years to try to define cutoffs for how much sex is too much. And one of them was like, well, if you're having 7 or more orgasms a week, that puts you in the hypersexual category. And I'm like, really? Like one a day? Like that? It's just arbitrary in terms of how a lot of people have defined this. And that's where a lot of the literature in this area gets messy.
I think it's inherently problematic to put a number on orgasms or frequency of sex. One of the big differences is that with OCSB, we can hold the nuance of subjectivity. And each client, it is about what feels out of control to the client. How is that impacting their life and functioning versus what are the particular sex acts happening and the frequency of the sex acts?
So when talking about out of control sexual behavior, I think it's really important to distinguish between the genuinely problematic behavior and the normal sexual variation. But because women are often judged more harshly than men for the exact same sexual behaviors, there's a risk that women with high but healthy sexual desires can end up being pathologized simply for violating cultural expectations around women and sex, right?
Absolutely. The word slut comes to mind. For someone who is a woman that enjoys sex or is exploratory. I mean, it goes all the way back to like the Greeks and this idea that a woman talking about sexuality, embodying sexuality, that is dangerous. And there are whole religions and cultures built around making that not happen.
Yeah. And so for women, just being desirous of sex at all and pursuing sex, it is something that sometimes for some of these women leads to shame because there are all these cultural expectations, but it also leads to a lot of judgment from other people. And so even though she might have this perfectly normal sexual drive, she's being pathologized for it simply because she's just not living up to whatever cultural expectation that she feels like she's supposed to, or that other people think that she should be living up to. And so I think women are often in this bind when it comes to pursuing sex and being open and honest and free with their desires, because there's just this societal double standard in terms of how their desires and behaviors are going to be judged and evaluated.
Yeah. And as you're saying that, it's making me think of like the spectrum of a desire level, right? Mm-hmm. So when I think of the stereotypes, I think of like the total sex crazed maniac and then the total prude, mm-hmm. right? That does nothing ever. And truthfully, we need to be able to exist in a space where sometimes we're feeling it and sometimes we're not.
Yeah.
And neither one is going to get pathologized.
Right. And that's a hard thing for people to do because we like to put people in boxes. And so, people tend to see this through a pretty binary lens where you're kind of either a prude or you're a slut. And it's like, well, what's the right level of desire to have? And it's like this arbitrary subjective thing, but there's a lot of social judgment that is often imbued here in how we talk about and think about this. But clinically speaking, how do you distinguish between somebody who simply has a strong libido versus someone whose sexual desire or sexual behavior genuinely feels out of control?
Well, I ask them and I say, I hear what you're telling me as far as the acts and the frequency, right? How is this looking in your life? Is it getting in the way of work? Is it getting in the way of relationships? Have you tried to stop this? What have you tried? How has that looked? When a client tells me that they have tried to stop a certain behavior because it causes them suffering, and they cannot stop this behavior no matter what consequence is before them, I would consider that out of control.
Yeah. And so it is, again, about the subjective component about how does this feel to the person, as opposed to you as the therapist projecting onto them and saying, I think you're doing that too much, right? That's not what we want to do in the world of therapy.
It's not. It's the old frame of sex addiction. Mm-hmm. Is you need to stop masturbating. Why? Because you looked at porn. Really? Like that's sometimes they're not even linked. So it's really about what is the problem for the person coming in, not what the therapist thinks the problem is.
I got to avoid that projection for sure. Sex is a skill, and like any skill, it can be learned, practiced, and mastered. Let me explain what I mean by that. For a long time, we've treated sex like it's something that you're either naturally good at or you're not. Like chemistry alone should just carry everything. But nobody expects you to just sit down at a piano and magically know how to play. So why do we expect people to just automatically know how to communicate in the bedroom and how to be a good sexual partner? The truth is that good sex isn't about some natural talent that only some people have. It's about how well you've honed your own bedroom skills. That's where Beducated comes in. They offer more than 150 expert-led online courses on sex and intimacy, everything from improving oral skills to exploring erotic massage, guided self-pleasure, and even kink, all taught by world-class educators. It's educational, it's practical, and yes, it's also hot. What I really love about Beducated is that it replaces sexual myths with real education. So instead of trial and error or relying on what you picked up from pop culture, you're actually learning what works and why from people who truly know this field. So if you're ready to stop putting intimacy on autopilot, click the link in the show notes and take the Beducated quiz to receive your personalized roadmap to sexual happiness. Sex is a skill, and Beducated is where you learn it. So, I imagine one of the challenges here, and this goes back to something I mentioned earlier, is that distress about sexual behavior doesn't always come from the behavior itself. Sometimes it comes from shame, religion, cultural messaging, or feeling like you're violating certain expectations around sexuality or gender. And so I wondered if you could speak about, how do you disentangle a genuine dysregulation issue from, say, an internal conflict around shame, right? Where it's really just about, I just don't think I should be engaging in this because my religion has told me I'm not supposed to do that.
I really look at the context of the person. Mm-hmm. We start to pull apart What do your different realms look like? What does your day-to-day look like? Who are you coming in contact with? Do you belong to different spiritual traditions? What is your background? How did you come up in your own soup of development, sexual development? And when we start to look at the broader picture of who this person is, we can see what is genuinely bumping up against their value system and upsetting them and making them suffer versus external pieces and external judgments.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about out of control sexual behavior, I think a lot of people would assume that fundamentally this is all about sex, right? And high sex drive, high sexual desire, and it's all sex, sex, sex. But in terms of what is actually underlying out of control sexual behavior, there can be some complex forces and motivational factors. And you mentioned earlier about the role of attachment. And so I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about some of the different emotional forces that might be underlying out of control sexual behavior, where it's not just about going out and seeking sexual gratification. And it's as simple as that.
Right. I mean, there are some people that may have a coexisting issue, like ADHD or, some kind of compulsion that's connected with their sexuality. I've studied modern attachment for a while, and this is people like Ellen Shore and how our nervous systems play off of one another. If we come from a place of trauma, if we come from a place of dysregulated attachment, it is easy to understand that the sexuality would be part of this, that your sexuality would also become dysregulated. If you are attaching to others from a place of, this is what I have to offer, this is all I have. As a woman, I came from that place often. It was like, well, what else is there? And I would lead with sex. I find it's often about attachment issues. Yeah. It's rarely just solely driven by the desire for an orgasm.
Yeah, it's not just, I'm horny, I need to get off, right? It can become this maladaptive coping mechanism for any number of traumas or attachment wounds or so forth, because maybe you learn over time that sex is the way that you connect, or it's sort of the pathway to sort of feeling embraced or loved or safe or so forth. And maybe it's not actually meeting those needs. And in the end, it's actually kind of making things worse because, just pursuing sex doesn't necessarily always meet and fulfill those needs. And I think that's really the fundamental pattern that we see here for a lot of people who have this out of control sexual behavior, is that they're engaging in it for the purpose of emotional regulation, but they do it and then they end up feeling worse. And so then they have sex again. Temporarily they feel better, but then just end up feeling worse about themselves in the end. And so it's sort of this vicious cycle that ultimately just creates more distress over time.
Yeah. There is the hungry ghost about it, where you go and I would just want to be connected for a moment, like if I can just get you alone for a moment, however that happens. And then you have this false sense of intimacy with the sex, and then it's over. And then what?
Yeah. And this is also where the differential diagnosis is really important because, you mentioned earlier that sometimes it could be ADHD that's underlying this, but it could be any number of affective disorders that might be masked as out of control sexual behavior, such as somebody who's in the manic phase of bipolar disorder, right? It can also be somebody who is clinically depressed, right? I know people often think about clinical depression as something where you tend to have reduced sex drive and sexual behavior. And for many people, it's that way. But some people cope with depression in different ways. Some people are externalizers. They turn outward and they might pursue more sex and more sensation-seeking types of sexual experiences that are high intensity or maybe even have an element of danger to them because they're just trying to feel something. And so it's one of those things where, again, you got to figure out, is it really out of control sexual behavior, or is there some underlying disorder that's in need of treatment and the sexual behavior is just the symptom of it? Because I think all too often, especially in the world of sex addiction treatments, they're trying to treat the symptom as opposed to the underlying cause.
Right. And that is why I love using acceptance and commitment therapy, because that model is not about trying to reduce symptoms. It's trying to change your relationship with how you're feeling, with what's happening. You're not trying to deny and split off part of your sexuality.
Yeah. And I think the acceptance and commitment therapy approach is really what I've heard from other therapists is kind of the most helpful approach for dealing with out of control or compulsive sexual behaviors, because it's a non-shaming approach to it that isn't just trying to manage the symptom and is trying to give people the framework for really understanding themselves and give them the coping tools and skills for better regulating and controlling their behavior. So in terms of out of control sexual behavior in women specifically, what are some of the biggest unanswered questions that we have about that? So as we mentioned, so much of the research that's out there on this topic is focused specifically on men. So what is it that's still lacking that we don't know as much about in terms of maybe how this presents or manifests in women?
Yeah, I get curious about things that are specific to women. So I get curious about a woman's history with how she might have internalized gendered ideas. I get curious about her history around conception and what does she think about conception and hormone shifting and, things that are just really specific to women that women historically have not had power over.
Yeah. And I think it's such fertile ground to explore because, again, so much of the research in this area has just been based on or built on research specifically on male populations. And again, I think some people have kind of been operating under this assumption that out of control sexual behavior is something that only men can experience. And it's like, nope, it's more complicated than that. And it can be experienced by people of any gender or sexuality. But we really need to study people in those different populations to understand what treatment approaches are going to work best for them. Also a lot of this work has specifically focused on gay men in particular. And so maybe what works in terms of understanding this for gay men or the models or theories or treatments might be different from how this operates in, say, a cis heterosexual woman. So, if we don't have the data, it's hard to know whether or not those existing models and treatments are actually going to work.
Right. And most of the data that we have is gendered. So the experiments and the clinical trials, they're created by men as well, oftentimes, and so that comes from a particular lens.
Yeah.
And so really it's about changing who's designing and executing these models.
Yeah. And I think for a long time, it was just kind of assumed that men and women were interchangeable. We've talked about this on the podcast before with Dr. Sarah Hill, where a lot of the science out there on sexual health in general has been what she calls bikini science, right? Where it's sort of assumed that men and women are just interchangeable, except for these little bits that might be covered by a bikini. But for the most part, that you can just do research on men and it's going to translate to women. And then, as we're finding out, it just doesn't work that way, especially when you factor in things like different hormone levels and hormonal shifts throughout the menstrual cycle. And then also menopause and how that changes things. Men and women aren't as interchangeable as the scientists might think that they are.
Yeah, I also think that this country in particular has a history of coming from a place of wanting to protect women with a lot of the research, and so they limit the research that they do on women because it's a very kind of fatherly, we're going to care for you guys and just measure you against the nearest man.
Yeah. So if someone listening feels like their sexual behavior is out of control, what's the starting point for figuring out whether there's really a problem? And how do you get support from a sex positive professional?
Well, let's see. If someone's really struggling and they want to do it differently, they want to do it differently than the typical addiction model, I would say try to get clear with yourself on, is this a me thing? Is this a thing where it's truly impacting and hurting my life functioning? Or is this something that someone is telling me? Has my partner just found me with pornography and now she's saying there's an issue when I personally don't think there's an issue? So it's differentiating, like, is this feeling out of control for you? And then from there, reach out to ASECT, reach out to Sexual Health Alliance. Do some online research of where can you go to think about this differently, to think about this in a more holistic, sex positive way. Look up OCSB, out of control sexual behavior. Look up problematic sexual behavior.
Yeah. And I think those are great starting points, with the first educating yourself to whatever extent possible, but consulting reliable sources and information. Because unfortunately, this is one of those topics where different people might give you drastically different answers. And, as a test of this before the show, I went to 2 different AI platforms and I asked them whether sex addiction is a thing. And one of them categorically said, no, it's not. And went down the route of explaining out of control sexual behavior and compulsive sexual behavior disorder and how these are better fits and models for it. And then the other one was like, sex addiction is absolutely real. And here's all the science behind it. And I'm like, holy shit. Like, depending upon which chatbot you're talking to, you might get a totally different perspective on this. And so you might need to consult different sources of information and recognize and understand that this is one of those topics where you're not going to find consistency in what everybody says because it's become somewhat ideological.
This is one of those topics where you really, truly have to start trusting yourself. Mm-hmm. What does it feel like to you?
Yeah. And I think it's really important if you're going to go down the route of therapy to find a certified sex positive professional, somebody who understands what the latest science and research and data in this area actually say, and who's not going to approach it from a shaming sort of perspective. Consulting a therapist who is certified through ASECT is a great start. I have links to some therapist locator websites on my website at sexandpsychology.com so that you can go and find professionals in your area who are qualified and understand this topic and can be best equipped to help you with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think certified is the key word here. Mm-hmm. Really someone who has been educated.
Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of therapists aren't really equipped to study this or to treat patients with this particular issue. I used to work in a counseling psychology PhD program, and we had one course in our entire 4-year curriculum that focused on sex and relationships. That's like one course, like covering the entirety of sex. So, I would try and turn all of my courses into like stealth sex ed courses so that therapists were getting other information about topics like this, because unfortunately, many therapists just don't get that kind of specialized training.
Yeah, no. So I took that course, but the course I took in grad school, you just drew your genitals. And I was like, well, who is that helping?
Yeah. Who is that helping?
Yeah. Well, now that we're talking about exploration, I actually just finished a book, and it takes people through the entire ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy model, on how to explore your sexuality in a grounded and positive and compassionate and exploratory way, instead of this classic, just biological, here's the data, we're going on a trip.
Do you know when your book will be out?
I don't know when it's going to be out. It's being looked at currently by a few different people. So I'm very excited, but I really want to get this information out, especially for people who are coming to these realizations later in life and need something to patchwork their sexual health together.
Yeah. Well, you'll have to be sure to let us know when the book comes out so that I can share it with my audience. So thank you again so much for your time, Jess. I really appreciate having you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Definitely. So you can check out my work at sexual-context.com or jesslevith.com. I will be at the Sexual Health Alliance Sexceptional Conference in a couple of weeks doing this training with Michael Vigorito on ACT and cisgender women, OCSB. It's going to be awesome.
Great. Well, I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.